Hello everyone, my name is Sonia Surabhi Gupta and today I am going to speak to you about the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution, as many of you would know, is one of the most important events of the contemporary history of Latin America. So what we are going to do today is try to understand the causes of this revolution, how it unfolded. We will try and appreciate the process of economic, social and cultural transformation that has taken place in Cuba since the revolution triumphed on January 1, 1959. And we will also try and have a look at the kind of difficulties and challenges that the revolutionary process has faced ever since 1959. So this revolution, as I was saying, triumphed in January 1, 1959, and it is when the Cuban people, led by their leader Fidel Castro and other leaders also, Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, Vilma Espin, etc., they brought down the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista and thus began the process of establishing Cuba as an independent and sovereign republic. We will also try and see why we need to kind of study about this revolution. It is one of the most significant milestones of the 20th century. And why we need to study is to kind of understand its importance and evaluate its legacy, not only for Cuban history, not only for the Cuban society, but also for societies around the world. So we will try and understand what were the historical causes that led to the revolution. What was the situation in Cuba before the revolution and what were the changes that the revolutionaries were fighting for? And we will see that therefore with what events the revolution unfolded, what were the salient happenings that finally led to the triumph of the revolution. But before we do that, I think it is important to kind of see a little bit about the geographical and the historical context of Cuba and what led to the revolution. Cuba is an island in the Caribbean. In fact, it is the largest island of the many that are there in the Caribbean Sea. If you see the map of Cuba, you will see that it is a long and narrow strip. It's a small population of about 11 million. Just to give you an idea, perhaps it's the same as Chennai, lesser than Delhi. So a small island with a small population, but of course the biggest island out of all that are there in the Caribbean Sea. This island has always had a special importance in the history of the Latin America and the Caribbean region because Cuba was one of the first places claimed for Spain by Christopher Columbus when he reached the American continent in 1492. By the 18th century, Cuba had become the Spanish Empire's most important source of sugar and was known as the sugar bowl of the world. And because of the sugar plantations that were there in the island, Cuba became an important destination of slave trade. The slaves were brought from Western African coast and they were made to work in the cotton plantations and then the sugar plantations all over Latin America, but particularly in Cuba and Brazil. So in order to understand what led to the revolution in Cuba, we must know not only this background, but also understand why, though in the rest of Latin America, the anti-colonial stirrings happened, happened much earlier, and most Latin American countries got their independence at the beginning of 19th century between 1810 and 1822. But Cuba could not achieve independence because of these slave-based sugar plantations. They were experiencing a boom at that time, in the beginning of the 19th century, and the Cuban elites were actually benefiting from the economic concessions that the Spanish monarchy gave them. So after several attempts, particularly since the 1860s, the struggle for Cuba's independence resumed in 1895 under the leadership of José Martí, Antonio Maceo, and Maximo Gomez. And when the victory of the Cuban patriots was almost there, was almost inevitable, the United States declared war on Spain and intervened in the conflict. So though Cuba gained formal independence from Spain in 1898, it immediately came under the control of the United States. And this actually happened through a treaty, it's called the Treaty of Paris, which was signed in December 10, 1898 between Spain and the United States. And under this agreement, Spain handed over the control of the island to the United States. And the US sent an army officer by the name of John Brooke to the Cuban territory to take control of the island militarily. So not only did the US actually take control of the island through military means, this was also accompanied by increasing US control of the economic resources of the island. So this is the reason why Cubans see the revolution that triumphed on January 1, 1959 as the continuation of their independence movement, whose objective after all was to establish an independent and sovereign republic. So I think having seen this historical background, we should try and now pinpoint the causes of the Cuban Revolution. The main reasons for the insurrections were actually the social ills of what the revolutionary called the pseudo-republic that had existed since the independence in 1898 to their times. Cuba was actually a nation of great inequality before the revolution. People, especially those who were in the rural areas, they lived in poverty, illiteracy, they lacked access to health and employment, and especially the Afro-Cuban population of the island lived in very impoverished conditions. The USA controlled 80% of Cuba's trade. The US firms ran the public utilities, the railroad, and all of the oil refineries. 2/3 of the food production came from the US-owned agribusiness enterprises in the island. US developers owned half of the arable land on the island. But to aggravate these problems which existed, on March 10, 1952, General Fulgencio Batista, who had a huge influence in the army there, conducted a coup d'etat, opening a phase of terror, authoritarianism, and further subordination to US interests. So in view of these rising economic and social problems, the priority of the traditional parties actually was not the Batista dictatorship. And when the kind of revolutionaries saw that Cuba was actually becoming a neo-colony, in fact a casino of the United States, this group of young people led by Fidel Castro decided on the alternative of armed struggle to overthrow the military regime of Batista. They believed that Cuba's was an incomplete independence and the country needed profound transformations. So though the revolution triumphed in January 1, 1959, the insurrection had become much earlier. The origins of the revolution had started on July 26, 1953, when Fidel Castro and his group of revolutionaries led an assault on the Moncada military outpost in Santiago, Cuba, which was supposed to be one of the most hated symbols of the Batista regime. That attempt failed. In fact, several young people were killed, others were arrested, and they were put in trials. And that was the case also with Fidel Castro, who was condemned to 15 years of prison. While in prison, Fidel made his famous defense statement that ended with the now famous words, and I quote him, "Condemn me, it does not matter, history will absolve me." Now, due to huge local and international pressure, these political prisoners, Fidel, his brother Raul Castro, and the other revolutionaries were granted amnesty after serving 22 months in prison. And they were released on May 15th, 1955. However, they soon realized that they could not function under the Batista dictatorship. They could not carry out their work towards establishing Cuba as a sovereign and independent country. So Fidel founded the July 26 movement and went in exile to Mexico. Many Cuban exiles in Mexico, people who were already there and who wanted to see an end of the Batista regime, they joined the July 26 movement. And it is in Mexico that the Argentine revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara also joined the Cuban rebels. They now wanted to go back to Cuba and start the armed rebellion against Batista. But the problem was how to get back there. Fidel had been collecting money for an expedition, And with the money that he had collected in the US, in Mexico, he bought an old yacht, an old boat named Granma. Granma, you know. And on the night of November 25, 1955, 82 Cuban rebels came on board of Granma to start their voyage and reached Cuba. And they formed a guerrilla army under the leadership of Fidel Castro, Ernesto Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, Juan Almeida, among many others. And with the help of the urban rebels who were already there in Cuba, and with the help of the peasants, you know, they carried on an armed struggle for almost 3 years. And on the New Year's Day, 1959, the revolutionary forces led by Fidel and Che overthrew the dictator Batista. Batista fled to the neighboring Dominican Republic with a huge amount, something like 300 million US dollars, which he had taken from the public treasury. After the revolution triumphed, jubilant Cubans also joined back from exile, and people, you know, came out on the streets to welcome the rebels, you know, in different parts of the island. The triumph of the revolution was a turning point in the history of Cuba. The revolutionary government, headed by Fidel Castro, soon took several economic and social measures. An intense literacy campaign eradicated illiteracy in the island within the first 2 years of the revolution. An intense agrarian reform was also carried out, which limited the large rural properties of local and foreign landowners. And as we mentioned before, the USA dominated the Cuban economy before the revolution. But the new government nationalized all US properties on the island and cancelled the sugar quotas with which the United States had a virtual sugar monopoly, not only in Cuba but in the entire Caribbean and in the Americas. So the changes that were promoted by the revolutionary government from 1959 onwards, you can imagine, provoked a strong confrontation with its powerful neighbor, which was just 90 miles away, the United States. And this occurred also in the international context of the dispute between the two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, which is referred to as the Cold War. The United States declared the Cuban Revolution as a threat to its interests and imposed a political and economic blockade that actually continues till our times, you know. It is worth mentioning that the UN General Assembly has for the last 30 years voted against the US embargo on Cuba. In 2021, only 2 countries voted against ending the US embargo on Cuba, and those 2 countries were United States itself and Israel. Cuba has had a very strong relationship with India. Ever since the inception of the revolution, Cuba was actually actively building bonds of friendship with the rest of the world, especially with the Third World. The Cuban Revolution coincided with the wave of anti-colonial national liberation struggles across the world. And the leaders of these newly liberated countries were conscious that a new world was in the making, where the developing nations would play a more significant role. It was the dawn of the non-aligned movement, which came into existence in 1961, following the Bandung Conference in 1955. In this context, soon after the revolution, Ernesto Che Guevara was sent on a mission to exchange views with like-minded nations that had indicated that they would follow an independent foreign policy. And on that mission, he reached New Delhi in July 1959. A few months after that visit, India opened its mission, its diplomatic mission in Cuba in January 1960, and a new history in bilateral ties started. India has always maintained friendly and mutually respectful relations with Cuba. What have been the achievements of the Cuban Revolution? The process of economic, social, political, ideological and cultural transformation that began in 1959 in Cuba is unparalleled in Latin America. We will just have a look at few areas. I mean, there are several: art, literature, culture, biotechnology, but let's focus on education and health. I'd like to focus especially on revolutionary Cuba's literacy program, because it was one of the proud accomplishments of the Cuban revolutions, and they have a very high rate of literacy in Cuba. In fact, illiteracy was rampant in Cuba before the 1959 revolution, and as I said in the beginning, in less than 2 years after the revolution, Cuba became completely free of illiteracy. Thousands of literacy brigades actually traveled across the island, even going to remote rural areas, laying the foundation of what would later become the most democratic education system in Latin America. Education was made free and public. Cuba is known for its internationalism also, and Cuba's literacy program has actually taught millions to read across the world. Today, more than 10 million people from over 30 countries have learned to read and write through Cuba's Yo Si Puedo program. Yo Si Puedo, yes I can. Now this program operates in countries ranging from Spain to Venezuela. Cuba is among the countries that invests most in education. It spends a staggering 13% of its GDP on education. In a world where over 770 million people still lack basic reading and writing skill, Cuba has a literacy rate of 100%. Along with the literacy campaign, there came also a cultural democratization, because the literacy campaign had empowered thousands of new readers and it legitimized reading and writing as never before. There was also a cultural democratization. People were able to learn dance, music, and we don't have the time to go into the details of the kind of cultural revolution also that took place, but a new cinema school came up. In fact, you might be aware of the fact that Cuban cinema was one of the best since the 1960s. It has had some problems now because of the economic sanctions that the island has been facing. And similarly, for example, with the highest record of Olympic medals in Latin America, Cuba owes its sports achievements also to the revolution. Another achievement of the revolution is Cuba's outstanding success in its healthcare system. Cuba established a widespread network of public hospitals and community-based clinics, emphasizing more on preventive and promotive health measures and building a unique system of training of doctors and healthcare professionals. It is a small wonder then that the country's infant mortality rate stands at 4.2 per thousand. It is the lowest in Latin America and even lower than the rate of infant mortality in the US. In fact, the UNICEF in 2011 declared that Cuba was the only country in Latin America without child malnutrition. And despite this decades-long US embargo, which I have been mentioning, Cuba has the highest percentage of physicians in the world, with 8.4 doctors per 1,000 people. And this statistics, of course, I bring you from the World Bank reports. Cuba has also taken healthcare beyond its border. It has been sending doctors and health workers to help deprived populations in developing countries. In fact, during the COVID-19 pandemic, which had played havoc with the Cuban economy, since the Cuban economy now mainly depends on tourism, and tourism was particularly affected by the pandemic. But despite these conditions, Cuba was the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean region to produce its own vaccines, Abdala and Soberana, to combat COVID-19. I think they have a third vaccine also which has passed trials now for pediatric use. Its doctors and health workers were at the forefront of international solidarity also. All through the pandemic, it helped, Cuban doctors helped even developed countries like Italy in the true spirit of humanity and internationalism. So, I'd like to conclude and say that these achievements of the Cuban Revolution are indeed praiseworthy, but it must be kept in mind that there have been tremendous challenges the revolution has faced. One of the major challenges, of course, is the embargo from the US. It's a blockade, it's an economic blockade which results in huge problems for the Cuban people. For example, I was telling you that the Cubans have been able to make their own vaccines, which they were not able to export to other countries because of the trade embargo. Companies that want to trade with Cuba cannot do it because the banks will not allow you to trade with Cuba. And that is why the Cubans sometimes say that they have been living under the embargo, but this has also forced them to depend on themselves. That is why their achievements in biotechnology, in medicine, in healthcare are remarkable also, because they have been able to produce indigenous medicines, and they've been able to produce their own doctors and trainers, and produce their own resources in order to face. So the Cuban people have been living through what is most certainly the longest economic blockade against any country. It began in 1962 and it goes up to now. Cuba was a part of Comecon, which was the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. It was a commercial association of the socialist bloc countries. But the dissolution of the USSR in 1992, etc., had a devastating effect on the Cuban economy. And the 1990s are known as the special period. Yet the Cuban Revolution did not disintegrate, as many of its adversaries had started predicting. Instead, the Cuban Revolution actually reinvented itself, and Fidel Castro, the main architect of the revolution, of course, passed away in November 2016. He's physically not there, but the edifice that he and his revolutionary friends and comrades had started constructing nearly 70 years ago is strong, and it has stood the test of times. So I think with this little explanation, you would have understood the salient features of the Cuban Revolution. I hope that you have also understood the historical context in which it took place and the difficulties and the challenges that the Cuban people have faced and have resolutely continued with building their sovereignty and their independence. Thank you so much.
Como ha dicho Fidel Castro, mientras el concepto de soberanía exista como prerrogativa de las naciones y de los pueblos independientes y como derecho de todos los pueblos, nosotros no aceptaremos la exclusión de nuestro pueblo de ese derecho. Sin embargo, los Estados Unidos pretendieron establecer una nueva prerrogativa arbitraria e ilegal, la de violar el espacio aéreo de cualquier país pequeño. Nosotros queremos construir el socialismo. Nos hemos declarado partidarios de los que luchan por la paz. Nos hemos declarado dentro del grupo de países no alineados, a pesar de ser marxistas-leninistas, porque los no alineados como nosotros luchan contra el imperialismo. Queremos paz. Esta disposición nueva de un continente de América está plasmada y resumida en el grito que día a día nuestras masas proclaman como expresión irrefutable de su decisión de lucha, paralizando la mano armada del invasor. Esa proclama es: patria o muerte.